What's going on, everybody? So today I want to talk about positive images of the future. And specifically, I want to talk about why positive images of the future might not be as good or as beneficial as we might think. And I want to talk about how to use them more wisely in Futures and Foresight. And just to clarify, for those of you who are new to Futures and Foresight, when I say images of the future, I mean different representations of the collective state of things of a society as a whole in all of its aspects in the future, usually in the form of scenarios. So that being clarified, in the field of Futures and Foresight, we investigate a range of different images of the future. And since we are exposed to different images of the future, some of us also try to promote those images that are a bit more positive than others, the so-called positive images of the future, because that is assumed to be good. Now, besides the fact that that is a sweeping endeavor that oftentimes ignores that in any future, there is always a lot of trade-offs because what is positive for some people might not be as positive for others. There is actually also an increasing amount of evidence showing that promoting positive images of the future might not be as beneficial as we might think. But let me share with you some references to prove my point. First of all, the idea that promoting positive images of the future is good comes from a widely cited book in Futures and Foresight, a book by Fred Polak that is indeed called The Image of the Future. In this book, Polak investigated a range of what he called images of the future in a range of societies in the past, including ancient Persia, ancient Israel, Middle-Age Europe, and so on, and he found that having a collective shared positive image of the future preceded and accompanied societal flourishment, meaning that those societies that had such a collective positive image of the future flourished, while those societies that did not regressed or even collapsed. Now, although this book is almost considered gospel in the Futures and Foresight community as supporting evidence that promoting positive images of the future is good, the analysis done by Polak in this book has actually been criticized because Polak conflated images of the future with fantastical and mythological representations from religion. So, because these representations might not represent a society in the future, but only an afterlife world, the causation argument advanced by Polak might have been confounded by another factor: religion. In other words, correlation doesn't imply causation, and although Polak argued that positive images of the future cause social flourishment, what he noticed might have just been a correlation between social flourishment and positive images of the future, masking other factors contributing to social flourishment, including but not limited to religion. We could also think of geography, natural disasters, pandemics, wars, luck, etc. All of these factors might have contributed to social flourishment or collapse. In short, it seems that positive images of the future are not as beneficial as we might think. But Polak aside, this argument has also been corroborated by evidence in the psychology literature. Or better, from the psychology literature, we know that some positive images of the future are more beneficial than others, which should make us more careful when we go and promote them. But let me explain in more detail what I mean by that.
The evidence I'm talking about comes from fantasy realization theory, a stream of literature published in a series of articles by the psychologist Gabriele Oettingen and her colleagues. Oettingen and colleagues found that positive thinking about the future in human cognition has to be divided into two types: expectations and fantasies. Future expectations are those desired futures that are believed to be plausible, and we can potentially guess their probabilities. Fantasies, on the other hand, are those desired futures that we fantasize about, without necessarily thinking about their probability or likelihood. Now, what is interesting about this theory for us in Futures and Foresight is that Oettingen and colleagues found that thinking about expectations leads to stronger effort, success, and well-being, while thinking about fantasies leads to less effort, success, and well-being. And these effects were replicated in a number of studies looking at the different impacts of these two types of positive futures thinking on studying motivation, number of job applications sent, and so on. But why is that the case? Well, that's because expectations make us think of a path to a goal, make us feel more energized, and as a consequence, we are motivated. While fantasies, on the other hand, make us indulge without necessarily increasing motivation. For example, if I think of a rewarding job I am likely to land in the future, an expectation, then I am more motivated to study now in college in order to get that job. But if I fantasize about being the president of my country in the future without being concerned about whether it can or cannot happen, which is a fantasy, I indulge, and as a consequence, I do nothing in the present to make that happen.
So, in short, it seems that not all positive thinking about the future is that beneficial. So what can we learn from this theory about future thinking for positive images of the future in the context of futures and foresight? Well, this theory is predicated upon the idea of personal futures, but the same cognitive mechanism seems to be at play for collective futures. So, if we follow this theory, it seems that positive images of the future are beneficial only when framed as expectations and not as fantasies, rather than all the time, as often assumed in futures and foresight. So what we can learn from this theory is that if we want our positive images of the future to be as beneficial as we claim, for example, in a futures and foresight workshop or project, we need to frame them as expectations. In other words, using futures and foresight jargon, we need to make it clear they are plausible and not utopias, rather than encouraging futures and foresight workshop participants to engage in free-flow thinking about the future. But that being said, are positive images of the future framed as fantasies completely useless? Well, actually, not really. Oettingen and colleagues also found that when we contrast desirable fantasies with less than desirable present realities, fantasies can be actually harnessed for good. But let me explain in more detail what I mean by that.
Contrasting a desired future with the present reality make us more motivated than when we either only think about the present or fantasize about the desired future separately. And these results hold for a variety of outcomes, including formulating plans, resolving personal concerns, for example, in a relationship, increasing tolerance, decreasing cigarette consumptions, and a range of other beneficial outcomes. But why is that? Well, that is because when we mentally compare a desired future with the present, we realize that the present stands in the way of the future, to quote from Oettingen and colleagues, which leads us to understand that something needs to be changed, that we need to take action. Now, interestingly, this occurs only when we think about the fantasy first, and then, only after that, we think about the present, and not the other way around.
So, in short, it seems that desirable future fantasies can be harnessed for good when presented in contrast to and before less than desirable present realities. So again, what can we learn from this theory about future thinking for positive images of the future in the context of futures and foresight? Well, again, although this theory is predicated upon the idea of personal futures, the same cognitive mechanism seems to be at play for collective futures, which makes this theory super interesting when we translate scenarios into strategy. And by the way, if you haven't done that yet, I have created a video on how to do that, so if you're interested, please check that out. More specifically, if we want to encourage organizational members to take action as a consequence of a Futures and Foresight workshop or project where we have created positive images of the future of the external environment, according to this theory, it seems useful to create desired future scenarios first, in other words, positive images of the future, and then to remind organizational members explicitly of the difference between those desired scenarios and the less than desired present reality afterwards, so that they are indeed more motivated to take action. Now, take a note that that might not be done explicitly in a Futures and Foresight project, because oftentimes in Futures and Foresight we spend a great deal of time and resources to investigate the present state of the organization and the environment with scanning, value chain analysis, 5 forces model, and so on. Then we move from that to scenarios, then maybe we move from scenarios to strategy, without necessarily stopping for a moment and explicitly reminding organizational members of the starking difference between the more desired future scenarios among the ones created and the less than desired present reality. So I truly hope that you liked this video and that it helped you to think more critically about whether positive images of the future are beneficial and about how to use them more wisely in your Futures and Foresight work. If you liked this video, I would super appreciate to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would mean a lot to me because it would encourage me to do more of these videos. And I will see you in the next one. Ciao!